Imagine a world where your entire life was dictated by someone else, where your body, your time, and even your thoughts felt like they belonged to another. A world where freedom was a distant dream, and every day was a struggle for survival, marked by the constant threat of mistreatment. Can you truly grasp what life was like for countless women in domestic service? In 610, add Number 1. Lack of education and opportunity. Consider for a moment the immense walls that stood between a domestic servant in 610 AD and any chance of advancement, any flicker of a brighter future. These were not walls of stone, but walls of societal structure, of ingrained prejudice, and of a deliberate denial of the tools that could build a path to something more. For a young woman trapped in the endless grind of a wealthy household, the idea of learning to read, to write, to engage with numbers, or to master any craft beyond the household chores was not just unlikely, it was almost unthinkable. Her world was confined to the boundaries of the estate, her knowledge limited to what she could observe or what her mistress deemed necessary for her duties. Think about the sheer impossibility of accessing education. In 610, formal schooling was a rare privilege, largely reserved for the sons of the elite, and sometimes their daughters, if their families were particularly enlightened and affluent. For a servant girl, especially one from a poor family or captured in war, the concept of a school was as foreign as the stars to a fish. Her day began before dawn, often with the lighting of fires, the drawing of water from the well, or the preparation of the morning meal. It ended long after the family she served had retired, with the tidying of the kitchen, the extinguishing of lamps, and perhaps the mending of clothes by candlelight. Every hour was accounted for, every moment consumed by the demands of her masters. Where would she find the time for learning? Where would she even find a parchment, an inkwell, or a quill, items of luxury in an age where books were painstakingly copied by hand and immensely valuable? The very idea of a servant seeking education was often viewed with suspicion, even disdain. Why would a servant need to read? It was believed that such knowledge might make her discontent, that it might give her ideas above her station, or worse, that it could enable her to forge documents or engage in deception. Her value was in her physical labor, her unquestioning obedience, and her ability to perform tasks with efficiency and without complaint. The more capable she was at scrubbing floors, preparing meals, or caring for children, the higher her worth to the household. Her intellect, her capacity for critical thought, her dreams of self-improvement, these were not only ignored but actively suppressed. Imagine a young woman, perhaps named Ilara, watching the children of her mistress receive lessons from a private tutor. She would see them tracing letters on wax tablets, listening to stories of ancient heroes, or learning rudimentary mathematics. A spark of curiosity might ignite within her, a quiet longing for the knowledge that seemed to flow so freely to others. That spark would quickly be extinguished by the weight of her responsibilities. She would be called away to fetch more kindling, to carry a heavy water jug, or to sweep a dusty corridor. The tutor would not even acknowledge her presence, for she was invisible, a part of the household machinery, not a person deserving of intellectual nourishment. This denial of education was not just about limiting her future opportunities. It was about locking her into a perpetual state of dependence. Without the ability to read legal documents, to understand contracts, or to calculate wages, she was incredibly vulnerable. She could be easily cheated. Her meager earnings, if she received any at all, could be misrepresented, and she would have no means of verifying the truth. She might be told she owed her master a certain sum, or that her period of servitude had been extended, and she would have no way to dispute. Her illiteracy rendered her powerless in any legal or economic transaction. It reinforced her status as someone to be commanded, not someone who could command her own destiny. Consider also the skills that were valued in that era. For a woman, even a free one, her education was often centered on household management, spinning, weaving, and religious instruction. For a domestic servant, these practical skills were her very existence. But there was no pathway from mastering these skills to achieving independence. A skilled spinner might produce beautiful yarn, but the profits would go to her master. Talented cook might create delicious feasts, but she would dine on scraps. Her talents were not her own. They were assets of the household she served. The lack of opportunity extended beyond formal education. It encompassed the inability to choose her own path, to learn a trade that might offer genuine independence, or to save enough money to buy her freedom or establish a small business. Her life was a fixed, unyielding trajectory, determined by the whims of her owners. She had no agency, no voice in her own future. If she dreamed of marriage, it would be at her master's discretion and often to another servant, ensuring that any children born of the union would also be bound to service. If she longed for spiritual solace, her access to religious services might be limited by her duties, or she might be excluded from the main family's worship. This denial of opportunity created a vicious cycle. Without education, she could not escape her servitude. Without escape, she remained in a position where she was denied education. It was a cage of circumstance, reinforced by the societal norms and legal structures of 610 odd, which saw many servants as property or at least as dependents with very few rights. The path to liberation through knowledge or skill was purposefully blocked, ensuring that the labor pool for domestic service remained constant, cheap, and utterly dependent. It was a life of endless toil, with no hope of personal growth, no chance to explore her own potential, and no whisper of a world beyond the confines of the master's estate. Her mind, her spirit, her dreams, all were suppressed by the relentless demands of a life where opportunity was a word she would never truly understand. Number 2. Nutritional deprivation and poor living conditions. Imagine living a life where the very energy you needed to perform endless, back-breaking tasks was constantly drained away by a lack of proper sustenance. Picture the constant ache of hunger, the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, not just at the end of a long day, but as a dull companion throughout the hours of relentless labor. For women in domestic service in 610, and this was not a rare occurrence. It was often the brutal reality of their existence. Nutritional deprivation was a silent, insidious form of exploitation, weakening them physically, making them more susceptible to illness, and diminishing their capacity for anything beyond survival. While the master's table might groan under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and rich stews, the domestic servant's portion was starkly different. She would often receive the leftovers, the scraps, or the cheapest, most basic staples. Her diet might consist predominantly of coarse grains, perhaps in the form of a watery porridge or a hard stale bread, supplemented by whatever vegetables were plentiful and inexpensive, if any. Meat would be a rare luxury, perhaps only offered on feast days, and even then, it would be the less desirable cuts, gristle, and bone rather than tender muscle. Dairy products, eggs, and fruits, while sometimes present in the household, were typically reserved for the family. The servant's diet lacked variety, essential vitamins, and sufficient calories to fuel a body that was expected to lift heavy burdens, stand for hours, and exert itself from dawn till dusk. Think about the physical toll this took. Constant feeling of weakness, dizziness, and fatigue would be commonplace. Anemia, caused by a lack of iron, would manifest as pallor, shortness of breath, and a perpetual tiredness that no amount of sleep could remedy. Without sufficient protein, muscles would weaken, making physical tasks even more arduous. The body, constantly in a state of energy deficit, would be less able to fight off infections. A simple cold could quickly escalate into a severe illness, a minor cut could fester, and chronic ailments would become debilitating. Historical accounts indicate that disease was rampant in this era, and poor nutrition significantly increased vulnerability. A servant who fell ill was a burden, not a valuable asset, and might face dismissal or even outright neglect. And then there were the living conditions. Forget the idea of a warm, private room with a comfortable bed. For the vast majority of domestic servants, their sleeping arrangements were rudimentary at best, and often appalling. They might sleep in a drafty attic, a damp cellar, or on a straw mat in a corner of the kitchen or a communal servants' quarters. Privacy was a luxury they did not possess. Their bedding, if they had any, beyond a simple mat or a thin blanket, would be old, worn, and infrequently cleaned, harboring fleas and other vermin. The air might be thick with the smell of smoke from the hearth, unwashed bodies, and the damp earth of a poorly ventilated space. Imagine the bitter cold of winter nights, when the master's family slept wrapped in furs by a roaring fire, while the servants shivered under thin coverings, the chill seeping into their bones. Imagine the suffocating heat of summer in cramped, airless spaces where sleep offered little reprieve. There was no escape from the elements, and no real sanctuary from the demands of their work. The spaces they occupied were often the least desirable parts of the house, far from the light and warmth, and rarely cleaned with the same diligence as the family's quarters. Access to basic hygiene was also severely limited. Clean water, while available for the household's use, might be scarce for a servant's personal washing. Bathing was infrequent, communal, and often a hasty affair. Changing clothes was a luxury, as most servants would possess only one or two worn garments, which they would wash infrequently and wear until they frayed into rags. This lack of hygiene, combined with cramped living quarters, exacerbated the spread of diseases. Lice, fleas, and scabies were common companions. Adding to their discomfort and misery, the physical toll of these conditions was immense. Chronic aches and pains from sleeping on hard surfaces, respiratory issues from damp and smoke-filled air, skin infections from poor hygiene, and constant vulnerability to epidemic diseases were part of the daily struggle. Their bodies were constantly under assault, worn down by labor, and deprived of the basic necessities for health. This perpetual state of ill health and exhaustion served the master's purposes, even if unintentionally. A weakened servant was less likely to resist, less likely to dream of escape, and more easily controlled. They were simply too tired, too hungry, too unwell to think of anything but getting through another day. This relentless cycle of deprivation created a profound sense of hopelessness. How could one plan for the future when the present was a battle against hunger and sickness? How could one dream of freedom when the body was too weak to even stand upright without a struggle? Poor food and wretched living conditions were not merely inconveniences. They were fundamental elements of a system designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost, turning human beings into expendable resources, their well-being sacrificed for the comfort and prosperity of others. It was a slow, grinding form of exploitation, stripping them of their health, their strength, and ultimately their very vitality. Number 3. Psychological manipulation and control. Beyond the physical deprivations and endless labor, women in domestic service in 610 and faced a constant, insidious assault on their minds and spirits. This was the realm of psychological manipulation and control, a pervasive system of fear, intimidation, and emotional subjugation that stripped them of their self-worth and left them feeling utterly powerless. It was a silent cage, invisible to the eye but potent in its grip, ensuring obedience not just through threat of physical punishment, but through the deep-seated fear of social ruin and abandonment. Imagine living in a household where your every action, your every word, even your very expression was under scrutiny. The master or mistress held absolute authority, and their moods could swing unpredictably. A small mistake, a dropped plate, a delayed meal, a wrinkle in a cleaned garment could elicit a torrent of verbal abuse, accusations of laziness, incompetence, or even malice. Constant fear of displeasing them, of incurring their wrath, created an atmosphere of extreme tension and anxiety. Servants were expected to be invisible unless summoned, silent unless spoken to, and utterly deferent at all times. This constant vigilance, the need to anticipate every desire and avoid every misstep, was mentally exhausting. Threats were a common tool of control. It wasn't always about the immediate physical punishment. Often, the fear of what could happen was enough. If you do not perform your duties perfectly, you will be sent away, was a common threat. For a woman with no family support, no money, and no connections, being cast out meant destitution, starvation, or worse. The roads were dangerous, begging was a last resort, and survival outside the protective, albeit oppressive, walls of a household was precarious in the extreme. This threat of dismissal, of being thrown onto the mercy of a harsh, unforgiving world, was a powerful motivator for obedience, ensuring that servants endured indignities rather than risking the unknown. Beyond dismissal, there were threats of further degradation. A master might threaten to sell a servant to a harsher household, or to separate her from any friends or connections she might have formed. If she had children, the threat of separating her from them was an even more potent weapon, a cruel leverage used to ensure absolute submission. The knowledge that her very existence, her limited security, and her relationships were entirely dependent on the whims of her owners created a profound sense of helplessness. Psychological abuse also included relentless criticism and belittling. Servants were often addressed with contempt, their intelligence questioned, and their efforts dismissed as inadequate. They might be called stupid, worthless, or ungrateful. This constant barrage of negative reinforcement eroded their self-esteem, making them internalize the idea that they were indeed inferior, incapable of making decisions or having valid thoughts of their own. Over time, this could lead to a shattered sense of self-worth, making it harder for them to imagine a life outside their subservient role, or to believe they deserved anything better. Consider the isolation. While a household might have many servants, genuine connection and support networks were often difficult to form. Masters might encourage mistrust among servants, fearing that solidarity could lead to rebellion or defiance. Servants might be forbidden from speaking to outsiders, or their letters might be censored, cutting them off from any potential external support. Their lives were confined to the household, making the master and mistress the sole arbiters of their reality and their only source of information. This isolation amplified their vulnerability to manipulation, as they had no outside perspective to counter the narratives of their oppressors. The master and mistress also controlled information. Servants might be deliberately kept ignorant of news from the outside world, or given biased information to reinforce their loyalty. They might be told that life outside was far worse, filled with dangers and hardships that made their current servitude seem preferable. This misinformation was designed to quell any nascent desires for freedom or change. Sometimes the manipulation was more subtle. A master or mistress might occasionally offer a small kindness, a leftover treat, a moment of praise, or a slightly less arduous task. These fleeting moments of apparent generosity were not genuine acts of compassion, but served to keep the servant hoping, to prevent total despair, and to reinforce the idea that their well-being was entirely at the discretion of their owners. It created a cycle of dependency where the servant learned to crave these crumbs of kindness, making them even more eager to please and less likely to resist. The psychological toll was immense. Chronic stress, anxiety, and depression would have been common. The constant fear of punishment, the erosion of self-esteem, and the profound sense of powerlessness could lead to a state of learned helplessness. Servants might become withdrawn, apathetic, or perpetually fearful. Their spirits, once perhaps vibrant and hopeful, would be slowly crushed under the weight of this mental and emotional oppression. They lived in a constant state of alert, their bodies tense, their minds racing to anticipate the next demand or avoid the next punishment. It was a life where their very thoughts were not their own, where their inner world was as constrained as their outward one, leaving them broken and utterly controlled. Number 4. Social isolation and lack of rights. Imagine a life where you were fundamentally alone, stripped of the most basic human connections, and with no legal standing to protect yourself. This was the stark reality for many women in domestic service in 610. Their exploitation was not just about the work they performed or the abuse they endured. It was deeply rooted in their utter social isolation and a near total absence of rights, making them profoundly vulnerable in every aspect of their existence. They were often treated less as individuals with inherent worth and more as disposable tools or property. Consider, first, the severance from family. Many domestic servants, especially those from impoverished families, were sent into service at a young age, sometimes sold by their parents to alleviate economic hardship or taken as captives in raids and wars. Once in a household, contact with their original families was often severely restricted, if not completely cut off. They might never see their parents, siblings, or childhood friends again. This forcible separation created an immense void, leaving them without the emotional support, protection, and advocacy that a family unit could provide. They were strangers in a strange household, beholden to people who owed them no loyalty or love. Within the master's household, their social standing was at the very bottom. They were not considered part of the family, even if they had lived there for decades. They ate separately, slept separately, and were often forbidden from socializing with guests, or even with some members of the master's family. While there might be other servants, forming deep, trusting bonds could be difficult. Masters often encouraged rivalries or suspicion among servants to prevent solidarity, fearing that a united front might lead to challenges to their authority. Furthermore, the transient nature of some servitude meant that friendships, if formed, could be abruptly broken if a servant was sold or dismissed. Marriage, a cornerstone of social life and security for many women in this era, was largely denied to domestic servants, or allowed only under strict conditions. A servant could not simply choose to marry. Her master's permission was almost always required, as her labor was a valuable asset that he would not wish to lose. If she did marry, it would typically be to another servant within the same household or a neighboring one, ensuring that any children born would also enter service. This meant her reproductive choices, her desire for a family of her own, were entirely controlled by her owners, reinforcing her status as a tool rather than a person. If she became pregnant outside of such approved unions, she faced harsh punishment, dismissal, or even forced abortion, as an illegitimate child would be an unwanted burden on the household. Beyond social isolation, there was the devastating lack of legal rights in 610. And the concept of universal human rights as we understand it today simply did not exist. The legal status of servants varied, but generally, they had very few protections. In some legal traditions, particularly those influenced by Roman law, slaves were considered property, res, having no legal standing of their own. While servants might technically be distinguished from slaves, the practical realities of their lives often blurred these lines, especially for those in perpetual debt bondage or those inherited with an estate. A servant could not testify against her master in court. She could not own property, or at least not in any significant amount, as anything she acquired could be claimed by her master. She could not enter into contracts. If she was physically abused, sexually assaulted, or unjustly accused, she had almost no legal recourse. Reporting abuse to authorities was often impossible. Who would believe a servant over a respected master? The authorities themselves were often part of the same elite class as the masters, and their sympathies lay with property owners, not with the propertyless. There was no independent body or organization to which she could appeal for justice. Imagine being wronged, perhaps severely beaten, and knowing that there was nowhere to turn, no legal aid, no sympathetic magistrate, no community elder who would step in. Cries for help would fall on deaf ears, or worse, would be met with further punishment for daring to complain. This profound lack of legal protection meant that masters could act with near impunity. The only potential check on their power might be the fear of public scandal, though often minimal for actions against servants, or the economic loss of a damaged or runaway servant, but these were considerations of convenience, not justice. This combination of social isolation and legal powerlessness created a life of profound vulnerability. Without family, without community ties, and without legal rights, a domestic servant was adrift in a society that saw her as expendable. Her personal safety, her well-being, and her very life were entirely at the mercy of her owners. She was an object to be used, not a person to be respected, and this fundamental lack of recognition stripped her of her dignity and left her utterly defenseless against exploitation in all its forms. Number 5. Sexual exploitation and widowability. This is a stark and deeply uncomfortable truth about the lives of many women in domestic service in 610. Beyond the physical labor and harsh conditions, these women were often exposed to a profound and terrifying vulnerability to sexual exploitation and abuse. In a society where women, especially those of lower status, had limited bodily autonomy, the power imbalance between a master and his female servant was often absolute, creating an environment ripe for coercion, assault, and forced sexual servitude. Imagine a young woman, perhaps barely a teenager, thrust into a household where she had no family protection, no friends, and no one to whom she could appeal. Her master, or even his adult sons or other male members of the household, held immense power over her fate. She was dependent on them for her very survival, for food, shelter, and a precarious existence. This dependency, combined with the lack of legal recourse mentioned earlier, made her an easy target. Historical records, though often sparse on the direct experiences of victims, hint at the pervasive nature of such abuse, with servants often being considered property that could be used as the master saw fit. The concept of consent as we understand it today was largely absent, especially concerning individuals in positions of power over those of lower status. For a female servant, no was often not an option. Refusal could lead to severe physical punishment, dismissal, or further degradation. The threat of violence, of being cast out onto the streets where she would face even greater dangers, or of having her meager rations cut, was enough to compel compliance. Her body was not truly her own. It was considered part of the master's assets to be used for labor, and often for pleasure. Think about the psychological trauma of living under such a constant threat. Every interaction with a male member of the household could be fraught with unspoken tension and fear. She might try to make herself invisible, to avoid eye contact, or to arrange her duties in a way that minimized her exposure. But escape was impossible. Her work kept her within the very walls that confined her. The master's bedchamber, the quiet corridors, the secluded corners of the house. These were not just places of work, but potential sites of profound danger. If a servant became pregnant as a result of such exploitation, her situation became even more desperate. The child would be considered illegitimate, a potential burden on the household, and often the master would deny paternity. The servant could be severely punished, dismissed, or even forced to undergo an abortion, a dangerous procedure in any era. If the child was allowed to live, it would almost certainly be destined for the same life of servitude, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. The social stigma attached to an illegitimate birth would fall entirely on the woman, further isolating her and diminishing any slim chance of a respectable future. The vulnerability extended to all aspects of her daily life. A servant might be required to bathe her master, or to dress him, or to perform tasks that put her in close proximity and alone with him, creating opportunities for unwanted advances. Even when not directly physically assaulted, the constant objectification, the knowing glances, the suggestive remarks, and the general atmosphere of her being considered a body to be used took a profound toll on her dignity and sense of self. Consider the absolute lack of justice. If she were to complain, who would believe her? Her word against that of a respected master or a member of his family. Such accusations would often be dismissed out of hand, or she would be accused of lying, of trying to gain advantage, or of attempting to seduce her master. She risked further punishment for daring to speak out, and her reputation, already fragile, would be utterly destroyed. There were no public defenders, no women's shelters, no sympathetic ears in positions of power. She was alone, silenced, and without any means of defense. Some pervasive sexual vulnerability was a deeply ingrained part of the system of domestic service in 610, and particularly for female servants. It stripped them of their autonomy, their dignity, and their fundamental right to bodily integrity. It was a terrifying reality that shadowed their every waking moment, a constant reminder of their powerlessness and the profound depths of their exploitation. Their suffering in this regard was often hidden, unspoken, and unacknowledged, yet it was a cruel and brutal aspect of their daily lives, leaving scars that went far beyond the physical. Number 6. Physical abuse and violence. Imagine living in a constant state of fear where the threat of physical pain hung over your head like a storm cloud, ready to burst at any moment for any perceived transgression. For women in domestic service in 610, physical abuse and violence were not exceptional occurrences. They were often an ingrained, accepted, and frequently brutal part of their daily lives. Power dynamic between master and servant was absolute, and corporal punishment was seen as a legitimate, even necessary tool to enforce obedience, productivity, and submission. Consider the sheer impunity with which masters and mistresses could inflict harm. Legal systems of the era, while varied, generally offered very little protection to servants against their owners. In many contexts, particularly for those who were legally considered slaves or near slaves, the master held the right to discipline their household as they saw fit. This meant that a beating, a lashing, or other forms of physical torment were often considered private matters, not subject to outside interference unless the servant was killed, and even then, justice for the servant was far from guaranteed. A dish dropped, a floor not scrubbed clean enough, a moment of perceived slowness, a disrespectful glance, or even just the master's bad mood could trigger a violent outburst. There was no due process, no chance to explain, no right to appeal. The punishment was swift, often unpredictable, and designed to instill terror and absolute compliance. Imagine a young woman, perhaps named Lyra, tasked with cleaning the intricate carvings on a wooden chest. Her hands, calloused and sore from a lifetime of labor, might slip, causing a small scratch. Instantly, a hand might strike her across the face, or a heavy object might be thrown at her. She would fall, tears stinging her eyes, not just from the pain but from the crushing realization of her helplessness. There would be no comfort, no apology, only the expectation that she would rise immediately and continue her work, perhaps even more diligently lest the punishment escalate. Types of physical abuse varied, but all were designed to inflict pain and exert control. Beatings with hands, whips, rods, or whatever object was at hand were common. Kicking, pushing, and shoving were also frequent. Servants might be denied food or water as punishment, or forced to stand for impossibly long hours. Their bodies, already weakened by poor nutrition and endless labor, were constantly vulnerable to injury. Broken bones, lacerations, bruises, and internal injuries were not uncommon. Yet the servant would be expected to continue her duties, regardless of her pain or suffering. Access to medical care was limited, and often non-existent for servants, so injuries could fester, leading to long-term disability or even death. The mistress of the house, while perhaps less likely to engage in heavy physical labor, could also be a source of significant cruelty. She might oversee the punishments, or even inflict them herself, especially on female servants. Verbal abuse could escalate into physical assaults, slaps, hair-pulling, or forcing a servant to perform demeaning tasks as a form of torment. Her emotional distress and frustrations could easily be displaced onto those beneath her, with little fear of consequence. Consider the psychological impact of living under such a regime of violence. Constant fear would lead to a perpetual state of hypervigilance, a deep-seated anxiety that would never fully subside. Sleep would be restless, filled with nightmares. The body would be tense, bracing for the next blow. Trust would be impossible, as those who were meant to provide her with sustenance and shelter were also her tormentors. This constant threat of physical harm stripped away her sense of security, leaving her feeling utterly unprotected and dehumanized. And what recourse did she have? None. Running away was perilous, often leading to capture and even harsher punishment, or to a life of destitution. Complaining was forbidden and would only invite more wrath. Her injuries, if visible, would be dismissed or hidden. Other servants, living under the same threat, might be too afraid to offer solidarity, lest they incur the master's anger themselves. The cycle of violence was self-perpetuating, reinforced by societal norms that viewed servants as property, not as individuals deserving of respect or protection. The physical abuse was not just about pain. It was about crushing the spirit, about breaking the will to resist, about instilling a deep and abiding fear that ensured absolute, unquestioning obedience. It was a brutal and dehumanizing aspect of domestic service, turning the servant's body into a canvas for the master's power, a tool to be beaten into submission, leaving lasting scars both visible and unseen for a lifetime of suffering and helplessness. Number 7. Economic exploitation. No pay or meager wages. Imagine working tirelessly day after day, year after year, for endless hours, performing the most arduous and demeaning tasks, and receiving little to no actual compensation for your labor. This was a core and deeply entrenched form of exploitation for women in domestic service in 610 AD economic bondage, where their work was essentially free or compensated so minimally that escape was impossible. Their labor generated wealth and comfort for others, while they remained perpetually impoverished and dependent. Many domestic servants were in essence enslaved or in a state of debt bondage. In some cases, they were captives of war, sold into servitude. In others, they were born into it, their parents having been servants or slaves, passing their status down through generations. For such individuals, the concept of wages simply did not exist. Their basic needs, a roof over their heads, rudimentary food, and a few worn garments were provided. But these were seen not as compensation, but as the master's investment in his property. Every ounce of their energy, every skill they possessed, belonged entirely to their owner, producing nothing for themselves. Even for those who were not legally enslaved but were free servants, the reality was often little different. Their wages, if they received any at all, were notoriously meager. These wages were often insufficient to save, to support a family, or to ever accumulate enough to buy their freedom or establish an independent life. Imagine earning just enough to barely survive, with no prospect of saving for an emergency, for old age, or for any future beyond continued service. This created a perpetual cycle of dependence where they were trapped by their poverty. Consider the cunning ways this economic exploitation manifested. A servant might be promised a certain wage, but deductions could be made for alleged breakages, for food, for lodging, or for taxes that the master claimed were due. Without the ability to read or write as previously discussed, and with no legal recourse, a servant had no way to verify these deductions. Her pay could be unilaterally reduced or simply withheld for long periods, leaving her with nothing. It was not uncommon for servants to work for years without receiving any actual coin, their wages merely accumulating as a debt that was never truly paid out. Think about the implications of this constant financial insecurity. A servant could not save to buy a small plot of land, to set up a modest dwelling, or to purchase even basic comforts. She could not afford medical treatment if she fell ill, making illness a potential death sentence or a reason for immediate dismissal. She could not contribute to her family if they were also impoverished. Her life was a hand-to-mouth existence, where every day's labor was immediately consumed by the bare necessities of survival, controlled entirely by her master. This lack of economic independence also meant a profound lack of mobility. She could not simply leave a cruel household if she desired to. Where would she go? How would she support herself? The streets were not a safe or viable alternative. Without funds, she could not travel to another town, seek new opportunities, or even buy a warm cloak for winter. Her poverty was a cage, trapping her in servitude as surely as any lock and key. Even the few possessions a servant might acquire, perhaps a treasured trinket or a small piece of jewelry, could be claimed by the master or stolen by others with impunity. There was no concept of a personal estate or inherited wealth for a servant. Anything she created, whether it was beautifully embroidered clothing, which she could not wear herself, or a delicious meal, contributed solely to the master's comfort and status, not her own. Her labor was her only asset, and that asset was entirely appropriated by another. This pervasive economic exploitation ensured that women in domestic service remained at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, with no hope of upward mobility. It perpetuated their dependence, ensuring a steady supply of cheap, exploitable labor for the elite. Their lives were defined by the endless cycle of toil for others' benefit, leaving them perpetually indebted, perpetually poor, and utterly without the means to forge a life of their own. Their physical strength and skills were harvested by their masters, leaving them with nothing but the emptiness of their hands and the weariness of their bodies, forever bound by the chains of economic powerlessness. Number 8. Forced labor and excessive hours. Imagine your entire day, from the first sliver of dawn to the deep quiet of night, being completely dictated by the demands of others, with no breaks, no personal time, and no end in sight. For women in domestic service in 610. And this was the brutal reality of their existence. A relentless, grinding cycle of forced labor and excessive hours that stretched their bodies and minds to the absolute breaking point. Their time was not their own. It belonged entirely to their masters, who extracted every ounce of their physical and mental energy. Think about the sheer impossibility of rest. A domestic servant's day typically began long before the master's family stirred. She might be tasked with lighting the fires in the hearths, fetching water from the well, a heavy and repetitive task, preparing the morning meal, or sweeping the floors. Her day would unfold in a continuous stream of chores: cleaning, cooking, washing clothes by hand, spinning thread, tending to children, running errands, serving meals, and performing countless other tasks necessary to maintain a large household. The rhythm of the house dictated her life, and that rhythm was relentless. There were no fixed work hours, no concept of a workday ending at a certain time. Her duties extended until the master's family retired for the night, and often beyond. If the family entertained, she would be serving guests long into the evening. If a child needed care in the middle of the night, she would be roused from her meager sleep. Her downtime was minimal, often just a few hours of uneasy rest before the next day's demands began anew. This constant vigilance, the inability to truly relax or disconnect, led to profound physical and mental exhaustion. Consider the sheer physical toll. Carrying heavy buckets of water or firewood, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees, grinding grain, kneading dough for hours, washing massive amounts of laundry in cold water, often using harsh lye soap. These were tasks that required immense physical strength and endurance. Doing them day after day without proper nutrition or adequate rest led to chronic aches, pains, joint problems, and premature aging. Her hands would be calloused and cracked, her back perpetually sore, her feet swollen and aching. Accidents were common due to fatigue, leading to injuries that would often go untreated. Imagine the absolute lack of personal space or time. A servant had no hobbies, no leisure activities, no opportunity to pursue her own interests. Every waking moment was dedicated to service. She might not even have time to properly attend to her own hygiene or mend her own worn clothes unless it was part of her assigned duties. Her life was lived entirely for others, stripping her of any sense of personal identity beyond her function within the household. This forced labor was enforced by a combination of fear and absolute power. Refusal to work, or even perceived slowness, could lead to severe physical punishment, reduced rations, or the threat of dismissal, which for a servant meant utter destitution. The master's word was law, and there was no one to appeal to. Laws and social norms of 610 generally supported the master's right to command the labor of his household. Viewing servants as assets whose productive capacity was to be maximized. The economic reality of the time also played a role. A large household, especially a wealthy one, required a significant number of hands to function. With technology limited, manual labor was indispensable for everything from cooking and cleaning to managing textiles and caring for livestock. This meant that servants were constantly needed, and their labor was cheap and abundant, making it easy for masters to demand excessive hours without fear of losing their workforce. Even holidays or religious festivals offered little reprieve. While the master's family might enjoy feasting and leisure, the servants would be working harder than ever, preparing elaborate meals, cleaning up after celebrations, and tending to the needs of the revelers. Their burden often increased during times of supposed joy, highlighting their constant, unwavering servitude. This relentless cycle of forced labor and excessive hours was not merely about getting tasks done. It was a fundamental pillar of their exploitation. It kept them physically exhausted, mentally drained, and utterly dependent. It robbed them of their youth, their health, and any potential for a life beyond drudgery. Their bodies became tools, worn down by endless toil, their spirits crushed under the weight of unrelenting demands, leaving them with no time, no energy, and no hope for a life of their own.